Charles Trenet found Edith Piaf sitting alone after a show no one had reviewed. He sat down next to her and said nothing. They stayed like that for an hour. The show had taken place in a Paris theater in the early 1950s. Not a major venue, not a career-defining engagement, but a mid-level booking of the kind that significant performers take when the calendar has gaps and when not performing is not a comfortable alternative to performing. The audience had been adequate in size and unremarkable in response. No critic of consequence had been present. The evening had produced no record of itself except the memory of the people who had been in the room. Piaf had performed, and the evening had been what it was, and when it was over, she had done what performers do when the evening has been exactly what it was expected to be and no more. She had gone backstage and sat down and been alone with the specific quiet that follows a performance that has not asked for anything beyond the ordinary, in a room that has given exactly that back. Charles Trenet was in the building for reasons that have not been preserved in any detailed form. He was not there to see her performance, or, if he had been, the accounts of the evening do not describe him as having watched it from the house. He was in the theater for some other reason, or he had come to the building for some reason connected to his own work, or he had simply arrived in the way that people arrive at places they are connected to, without always having a precise reason. What the accounts describe is the moment he came across her, sitting in the backstage area, alone, in the post-performance quiet. He sat down. He did not say anything. Not a greeting, not an observation about the evening, not the kind of professional pleasantry that people in the same industry exchange when they encounter each other in the spaces between engagements. He simply chose the chair closest to where she was sitting and occupied it, and the room continued being the room, with the addition of a second person who was choosing, for reasons that neither of them needed to state, to be in it. What Piaf was sitting in, on that particular evening, was not depression or grief or any of the larger conditions that her life had given her occasion to carry. It was more ordinary than that, and in some ways more difficult to name for being ordinary. Performers who work at the level she worked at, with the degree of commitment she brought to every stage she stood on, are not comfortable with the ordinary. The ordinary is what they are trying to escape when they go to the stage. And when the stage returns them to the ordinary, as it occasionally does, because no performer can be extraordinary every night, because some evenings are simply evenings, the return has a specific quality of flatness that is different from anything outside the performing life, and not easy to explain to anyone who has not experienced it. Trenet let it be what it was by sitting in it with her. The accounts of what the hour contained agree on the absence of conversation more than on any other single detail. There may have been words at some point, a sentence or two, a brief exchange of something that is not silence, but is close to it. But the dominant quality of the hour, as it has been preserved in the accounts of the people who knew about it, was the quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet, a quiet that both of them had the experience to know was the right response to what the evening had been. At some point, without ceremony, the hour ended. They moved. The evening continued in the direction that evenings continue. The people who knew about this, who heard about it from one or the other of them, in the oblique way that performers sometimes mention things they have not made into stories, described it as being, for Piaf, one of the evenings that she remembered. Not because something had happened in it that was dramatic or significant in any way that could be pointed to and named, not because Trenet had said something that changed anything, or because the silence had resolved any of the conditions that had been present in the room when he arrived, but because he had sat down, and because he had known why, and because that knowledge had made the hour different from the hour it would have been if he had not come in. This is a difficult quality to describe in the terms that stories usually use. Stories are usually about things that happen. This is a story about the presence of someone who understood that nothing needed to happen, that the most useful thing a person could offer, in a specific moment, was the acknowledgement of the moment's quality by choosing to remain inside it rather than replacing it with something else. To understand why this is a story worth telling, you have to understand who Charles Trenet was in the Paris of that era, and what his presence in that backstage room represented. Trenet had been, since the late 1930s, one of the most distinctive and beloved figures in French popular music. Where Piaf's music moved through the particular register of urban longing and emotional intensity that the Paris Chanson tradition had developed in the cabarets and clubs of Montmartre and Pigalle, Trenet's moved through something different, a register of lightness, of the specific joy that the French language produces when it is used to make music that sounds like the world is a good place to be in. He was playful where she was earnest. He had written La Mer, one of the most recognizable French songs in the world. He had brought to French popular music a quality of aesthetic pleasure that was different in its nature from what Piaf brought, and that was not less significant for being different. Paris in the early 1950s was a city in the specific condition of a place that had come through something enormous and was trying to locate its footing in what came after. Both Piaf and Trenet had navigated the post-war reconstitution with their careers intact, but the navigation had required things from each of them that the pre-war world had not required. They were, by the early 1950s, performers who had been through something, and the experience of having been through something changes the quality of understanding that two performers can have of each other when they find themselves in the same room. They were not, in the ordinary sense, a natural pair. Their artistic temperaments were so different that the connection between them, when it manifested, operated on grounds that had nothing to do with their music. What connected them was the part of both of them that existed prior to the music, the specific knowledge of what it is to perform, to give something of yourself to a room that may or may not receive it, to walk off a stage in the particular condition of having been fully committed to something that the audience may have taken less seriously than you did. Trenet knew this condition. Every performer of his experience and duration knew it. But knowing it in the abstract, from one's own experience, is different from being in a position to recognize it in someone else and to respond to the recognition in a way that doesn't require explanation. He sat down. He said nothing. He recognized what she was sitting in, and he chose to be present with it rather than to interrupt it. In the years that followed, both Piaf and Trenet continued to produce the work that the world associated with their names. Piaf toward the darker and more emotionally concentrated performances of the later 1950s and the early 1960s. Trenet through a continued productivity that sustained his particular quality of musical joy across decades. Their paths crossed at intervals, in the way that the paths of two significant figures in the same general cultural world cross at intervals, without those crossings necessarily becoming sustained relationships that get documented and described in any detail. But the evening in the Paris theater backstage was something that Piaf mentioned, in the oblique way she sometimes mentioned things she had not made into formal anecdotes. She mentioned it as an example of what it means when someone understands, without requiring it to be explained, what the moment you are in is and what it needs. The understanding without explanation, the recognition without ceremony. The choice to sit down and be present with something rather than to replace it with something more comfortable. Trenet and Piaf moved through the world in very different registers. His music said the world was light. Hers said it was deep. His stage manner was expansive and joy-seeking. Hers was concentrated and inward-burning. The things they gave their audiences were, in many respects, opposite things. But what they shared, what allowed the hour to be the hour it was, without requiring any conversation to explain itself, was the knowledge of what performing costs, and what it produces, and what it does not produce, and what that absence feels like in the quiet after the audience is gone. She had been alone. He had arrived. The room had been what it was, and they had been in it together, and neither of them had needed to make it into anything other than what it was. This is not a small thing to offer another person. It is, in fact, one of the rarest things one person can offer another. The willingness to be present without requiring the moment to be transformed into something more manageable. The theater's probably gone now, or refaced or repurposed for something that has no connection to the evening it contained. The show left no record. The hour left no record, except the kind that lives in the accounts of people who heard about it and understood what it meant. He had found her alone. He had sat down. He had said nothing. And she had not forgotten it.